The hearing room was already humming with that peculiar electricity that only comes when the air is thick with unspoken stakes. Journalists filled the back rows, their pens poised, cameras set to catch every flicker of expression. Committee aides shuffled papers with the urgency of people who knew that in the next hour, reputations could be remade or destroyed. Pete Hegseth entered like he had been here 100 times before, shoulders squared, stride steady, the confident half-smile of a man used to commanding both a battlefield and a television studio. His medals weren't on his chest today, but the aura of service and status clung to him like an invisible uniform. He reached the lectern with a deliberate pace, the polished oak gleaming under the harsh white lights, and rested his hands on its edge as though claiming the space as his own. When he began speaking, his tone carried that practiced warmth of a cable news segment, opening measured, cordial, seemingly respectful. But beneath it was something sharper, the steel edge of someone who had come here not just to debate policy, but to dominate the moment. His eyes found Jasmine, seated 3 chairs to his left. "I'm sure," he began, letting the pause hang in the air just long enough to make people lean in, "that she comes from humble beginnings." He allowed himself a thin, deliberate smile, the kind that said he already believed he'd scored the first point. Oh, that experience didn't make her soft. The words didn't shout. They didn't need to. They were aimed like a sniper's shot, subtle enough to feign civility, pointed enough to wound. In the front row, someone's pen froze mid-sentence. For a heartbeat, the air felt vacuum-sealed. Jasmine didn't move. Her hands rested evenly on the table before her, palms flat, fingers lightly spread. Her eyes locked on him, steady, unblinking, as though she was looking through him, past him, into the small, hollow place from where such remarks were born. Her jaw tightened, just enough for the cameras to catch. The insult coated in the sugar of small talk was unmistakable. Roots implied as weakness. Her upbringing framed as a liability. It wasn't a policy critique. It was a personal provocation. Rustle spread through the gallery. Some leaned forward. Others glanced sideways, gauging reactions. On the far right, a young reporter's brow furrowed, already composing the lead sentence in her head. The narrator's voice broke through in the mind's ear. In just 10 seconds, a subtle insult cloaked in small talk sets the stage for a moral lightning strike. Pete leaned back slightly, as though confident the blow had landed. But Jasmine's stillness was not retreat, it was calculation. From the corner, a flashbulb went off. The image would later circulate online. Jasmine's profile lit starkly, her gaze sharp as glass, the faintest curl of defiance at the corner of her mouth. Her breathing was slow, controlled, each inhale measured as though she were absorbing not only the insult, but the energy of the entire room. She didn't break eye contact. She didn't reach for the microphone. She let the weight of silence stretch, until it was Pete who shifted first, clearing his throat. Somewhere, someone tapped a pen against a notepad, a sound almost deafening in the tense quiet. A clerk shuffled papers at the side table, trying not to be noticed. Then, very subtly, Jasmine leaned forward. Not enough to speak yet, but enough to signal the shift. It was the kind of movement a predator makes before it pounces, unhurried, precise, inevitable. Every viewer in the room, and later every viewer watching the replay on screens across the country, would understand that they were seeing more than a political exchange. They were witnessing class, identity, and power colliding in real time. This was not just about her. This was about everyone whose beginnings had been used against them as proof they didn't belong. Her stare held a promise, quiet but unshakable. This won't stand. And in that promise was the first spark of what would become the most replayed, dissected, and celebrated 10 seconds of the entire hearing. Asterisk. The hearing proceeded as though nothing had happened. Papers shuffled. Microphones crackled, But the room's energy had shifted. The insult lingered like smoke after a match had been struck. The narrator's tone deepened. To understand the weight of that moment, you have to understand the woman sitting across from him. Jasmine Crockett was no stranger to rooms like this. Rooms where the powerful used politeness as a blade and tradition as a shield. She had walked into such spaces her entire career, first as a young defense attorney in Dallas, then as a civil rights advocate, and now as a congressional figure unafraid to call out injustice where it hid. But the roots Pete had dismissed so easily were more than a personal detail. They were the very foundation of her political identity. She had grown up in the southern part of Dallas, in a neighborhood where the hum of freight trains and the distant wail of sirens were part of the soundtrack. Her parents, working class and determined, instilled in her the idea that education was not just a path to success, but a duty to yourself, to your community, to everyone who'd been told their dreams were too big for the place they came from. Camera of memory panned to long nights in a cramped apartment, her textbooks spread across a kitchen table, still smelling faintly of cornbread. She had studied for the bar exam, while the sound of kids playing basketball echoed from the cracked court outside. In law school, she worked part-time jobs, each paycheck stretched to cover both tuition and the gas it took to get home for weekends. Where she still volunteered at the community center. She didn't just come from her roots. She carried them, proudly, into every case she fought. But in Washington, roots often meant something else entirely. They were shorthand for provincial, unworldly, and implied lack of sophistication. In certain political circles, the only roots worth boasting about were ivy-covered, centuries-old, and tied to generational wealth. And Pete Hegseth understood the power of framing. He had built a career on it, using his military service, his media platform, and his polished demeanor to shape narratives before his opponents could. In one sentence, he had tried to frame Jasmine's entire life as a liability. She listened now as a witness was called, a former college roommate, flown in to testify about a policy proposal under review. The woman's voice carried warmth as she recalled Jasmine's relentless work ethic. She would study until 2 in the morning and then wake up at 6 to volunteer at the courthouse, the witness said. She didn't just want to be a lawyer, she wanted to make sure justice actually worked for people who couldn't afford it. Jasmine glanced at the witness, offering a small nod of thanks. Pete leaned back, arms crossed, his expression a mask of polite skepticism. Another witness followed, a community organizer from Dallas, who described how Jasmine had led pro bono legal clinics in neighborhoods where residents feared eviction or deportation. She knew everyone's name, the organizer said. She'd show up at people's doors with legal forms and explain them line by line. The contrast was stark. For Jasmine, her roots were a source of connection and accountability. For Pete, they were ammunition. When the testimony concluded, Pete adjusted his microphone. "That's a nice story," he said, his voice carrying the faintest trace of condescension. "But Washington isn't a neighborhood potluck. It's not about good intentions. It's about making the hard calls." The phrase landed like a challenge. Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. She could feel the weight of the moment building, the subtle push for her to react too soon, too sharply, so the story would become about her temper instead of her point. Instead, she leaned back, allowing a breath of space between his words and hers. "When you've seen what happens to people when government turns its back," she said evenly, "you understand that good intentions aren't a weakness. They're the beginning of every hard call worth making." The room stilled again, not with the sudden shock of an insult, but with the measured force of a woman quietly reclaiming the frame. Asterisk, the hearing's rhythm began to take shape. Questions, answers, brief interruptions. But beneath that steady drumbeat was a different tempo, quicker, sharper, the pulse of a room waiting for another strike. Pete's earlier jab still echoed, But Jasmine hadn't rushed to counter. She was letting the record fill itself, brick by brick, with testimony that painted a fuller picture than any single rebuttal could. The committee chair called the next witness, a small business owner from Dallas, whose store had nearly closed during a zoning dispute. The man adjusted his tie, clearly unused to such formal surroundings, and spoke with a deliberate steadiness. "She came to one of our neighborhood meetings," he said, glancing at Jasmine. "Didn't make a speech, didn't bring cameras. She just sat and listened for 2 hours. When she spoke, it was to tell us exactly which forms to file, and who in the city office would actually take our call. That's why we're still in business." Pete's pen tapped softly against his notepad. He didn't look at the witness. His gaze stayed fixed on Jasmine, as if willing her to falter under the praise. The next to speak was a former legal aid client, woman in her early 60s, whose husband had died unexpectedly, leaving her with hospital bills and a foreclosure. Notice, her voice wavered but didn't break. "I didn't know my rights," she said. "The bank was ready to take the house. Miss Crockett came to my church one Sunday, sat in the back until service was over, and then helped me file the paperwork. To stop it, she didn't have to, but she did." The woman's words carried no theatrics, just the raw clarity of lived experience. It was the kind of testimony that couldn't be spun without sounding callous. Still, Pete leaned toward his microphone. "These are touching anecdotes," he said, his smile tight. "But anecdotes don't govern a country. Washington requires more than sympathy." The gallery murmured, some heads turning toward him in open disbelief. Jasmine kept her eyes on the witness, letting Pete's words hang unanswered, not because she had no reply, but because every second of his dismissiveness was doing the work for her. A third witness was sworn in, a former colleague from the Texas legislature. "We worked on opposite sides of the aisle," he admitted. "But I'll tell you, she read every line of every bill. She fought like hell for her district, even when it wasn't politically convenient. Roots like hers. That's why she could see through the noise and focus on what mattered." Pete finally looked at the speaker, eyebrows raised. "So she's determined. That's admirable. But tell me, how many times did she have to compromise those values to get something passed?" The former colleague didn't miss a beat. "Compromise is different from surrender. I never saw her surrender." That landed. The sentence lingered like a slow tolling bell. Jasmine shifted in her seat, the faintest sign that she was preparing to step in. Her hands, folded on the table, loosened just enough for her fingers to curl over the edge of her notes. She leaned forward slightly, the posture of someone ready to move from defense to offense, but she didn't speak yet. She let the narrative keep building, knowing the more the record reflected her work, unaltered by her own framing, the harder it would be to dismiss her later. The narrator's voice slid in like a camera dolly moving closer. Layer by layer, the testimonies built a wall, not to shield her, but to stand as proof that her roots were not a liability, but the very thing that had made her relentless. Pete checked his watch, a small gesture caught by one of the cameras. It looked impatient, but it was something else, recognition that momentum was no longer on his side. And still, Jasmine waited. The chair's gavel fell lightly, signaling a shift. The witnesses stepped down one by one, the echo of their words still hanging in the air like the scent of rain before a storm. The committee's attention shifted back to the dais, where Jasmine sat, her shoulders squared, her eyes scanning the room as if taking a silent roll call of every person present, friends, foes, and those pretending to be neutral. The air felt different now. The testimonies had been like drumbeats, steady and cumulative, but Jasmine's movement as she rose from her chair was the sudden crash of cymbals. She did not rush. She let her chair slide back with the faintest scrape, the sound slicing through. The murmurs in the gallery. Her fingers gathered her notes, not because she needed them, but because the action gave the camera something to follow, a visual cue that she was ready to speak. When she reached for the microphone, there was no hesitation. Her voice came low and measured, the kind of tone that made people lean forward without realizing it. "My roots," she began, "are not a story I tell to make myself look good. They are not a campaign slogan. They are the reason I stand here. Today," she paused, letting her gaze sweep the room, finally resting on Pete. "And they are not a weakness." Pete's jaw twitched, a tiny betrayal of emotion that most wouldn't notice. Jasmine noticed. She didn't look away. "I grew up in South Dallas. My parents worked long hours, sometimes 2 jobs, just to make sure there was food on the table. And books in my backpack. I watched my neighbors get evicted when the factory closed. I saw classmates disappear from school because their families couldn't afford health care. That's not a soft upbringing. That's an education in survival." Ripple moved through the audience, a subtle shift in energy. Some leaned back, arms crossed in silent approval. Others leaned forward, eyes bright, catching every word. She continued. "When I became a lawyer, I didn't take the high-paying job at a corporate firm. I chose to work in courtrooms where the floors were scuffed and the clients didn't own suits. I defended people who couldn't pay me because I remembered the faces of the people I grew up with, and I knew they deserved someone in their corner." The chair glanced toward Pete, who was still sitting with his arms crossed, his smile now a shade tighter. "This," Jasmine said, her hand pressing flat on the table for emphasis, "is why I ran for office. Not because I thought it would be easy, not because I wanted to fit in with this place, but because too many decisions were being made by people who had forgotten what it's like to live with the consequences of those decisions." Pete shifted in his chair, leaning toward the microphone. "And how do you define hard choices, Congresswoman?" His voice carried that same practiced calm, but there was a challenge beneath it, like the sharp edge of a concealed blade. "Because in my experience, leadership means making calls that sometimes hurt people in the short term for the greater good." She met his eyes without blinking. "And in my experience, calling harm a greater good is how the powerful justify the damage they inflict on the powerless." A few audible gasps broke from the gallery. One reporter's pen scratched furiously against paper. Another adjusted a camera angle for a close-up. Jasmine's voice steadied even further, as though she were speaking not just to Pete, but to every person watching on television, every viewer scrolling through clips online later that night. "You talk about hard choices. I've seen hard choices. I've stood with families who had to choose between paying rent and buying medicine. I've represented clients who had to plead guilty to crimes they didn't commit because they couldn't afford bail. I've comforted mothers who had to bury their children because the system decided their lives were disposable. Those are hard choices, and they were made for them by people in rooms like this." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the weight of her words, full of the unspoken challenge they carried. Pete cleared his throat, leaning closer to the mic. "You think empathy solves these problems?" She shook her head slowly, deliberately. "No, empathy doesn't solve problems by itself. But without it, the solutions you make will crush the very people you claim to serve." Her tone sharpened, though it never rose in volume. "My roots taught me that power without empathy fractures communities. That's not sentimentality. That's survival. And if that makes me soft in your eyes, then maybe Washington could use a little more softness." The room erupted not in chaos, but in a wave of murmurs, a rustling tide of reaction. Reporters exchanged glances, some already imagining the headlines. Staffers scribbled notes, knowing this exchange would be clipped and replayed across every platform. By nightfall, Pete leaned back, lips pressing into a thin line. "Nice speech," he said finally, his voice carrying the faintest edge of mockery. "But speeches don't change reality." "No," Jasmine said, her voice quiet but resolute. "Actions do. And my record is proof of mine." The narrator's voice slid in over the moment, not to diminish it, but to frame it. It wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a declaration. In the span of a few minutes, she had turned an insult into a weapon and aimed it not at the man across from her, but at the entire system that allowed such dismissals to exist. The chair cleared his throat, attempting to steer the hearing back to the official agenda. But the exchange had already stolen the spotlight. Everyone in that room knew the tension had shifted. What had begun as Pete's calculated jab was now the foundation for Jasmine's moral offensive dot as she sat down. A faintest smile touched her lips, not of triumph, but of readiness. She knew this wasn't over. The confrontation was still coming, and when it did, it would be the culmination of every beat she had just set in motion. And Pete, though he masked it well, seemed to know it too. The chair's voice was steady, procedural, but the undertone was clear. "We'll now move into open questioning between the participants." This was the moment both had been circling toward all morning. Pete leaned toward the microphone first, a practiced smirk on his face. "Congresswoman Crockett," he began, drawing out her title as though the formality itself were a subtle challenge. "You talk about empathy, about understanding people's struggles. I respect that. But leadership, real leadership, isn't about telling people what they want to hear. It's about making tough calls, even when it costs you politically." The words were smooth, rehearsed, but there was a coiled energy behind them, a readiness to strike. Pete thrived in this terrain, shaping debates so that compassion looked like weakness and decisiveness looked like ruthlessness. Jasmine didn't blink. She let the silence sit for a heartbeat, longer than was comfortable before answering. "I agree leadership isn't about telling people what they want to hear," she said, her voice calm but deliberate. "It's about telling them the truth, and then standing with them when that truth is hard to live with." Pete tilted his head, the gesture part disbelief, part provocation. "So when you oppose budget cuts that could stabilize the economy, is that truth-telling? Or is it protecting your popularity?" Her gaze stayed steady. "It's refusing to balance the budget on the backs of the people who can least afford it." He leaned in further, pressing. "Sometimes pain is necessary for long-term gain. That's not cruelty, it's discipline." The gallery stirred. Someone in the press row tapped out a quick message on their phone. Jasmine's reply came, without hesitation. "And sometimes that discipline is just cruelty wearing a respectable suit." The narrator's voice slid in, almost like a camera zoom. This was no longer about the insult. This was about two visions of governance, one that saw people as numbers to be managed, and one that saw them as lives to be protected. Pete tapped his pen against his notes. "Congresswoman, if you lead with empathy first, you risk making choices that feel good in the moment, but fail in the long run. The world is competitive. Our adversaries, foreign and domestic, aren't going to care about our feelings." "I'm not here to make policy that feels good," Jasmine said, leaning slightly toward her microphone. "I'm here to make policy that works. And if it works, it will protect people both now and in the long run." The idea that empathy and effectiveness are opposites is a false choice, one that's been sold to justify policies that cause harm. Pete gave a short, quiet laugh, the kind that was meant to dismiss without having to argue. "So you're saying it's possible to have both?" "I'm saying it's impossible to have either if you strip out the human cost," she replied. The chair tried to interject, but neither of them broke eye contact. The air between them was taut, a live wire waiting for one more jolt. Pete shifted tactics. "All right, Let's talk specifics. National security. Do you support military interventions that prevent threats before they reach our shores, even if it means civilian casualties abroad? It was a loaded question, and they both knew it. Jasmine inhaled slowly. I support defending our country, but I also believe that every civilian life has value, whether it's here or across an ocean. If our security depends on disregarding that, we need to rethink our strategy. So you'd tie our hands? Pete shot back. I'd tie them to our principles, she said sharply. The room's soundscape was a mix of shuffling papers, distant camera clicks, and the quiet hum of fluorescent lights. The tension was so concentrated, it felt like even the air molecules were listening. Pete leaned back, spreading his hands slightly. Principles are noble, but noble doesn't keep us safe. Jasmine's reply was immediate. And fear doesn't keep us free. That line landed like a hammer. A reporter in the second row mouthed the words to themselves, already imagining them in a headline. The chair cleared his throat again, but the exchange had already spilled beyond parliamentary. Control. This was theater and testimony and moral trial all at once. Pete pressed forward one last time. So, in your model of leadership, how do we make those hard choices you speak about without becoming cold or detached? Jasmine's eyes softened, but her tone didn't waver. You start by asking who's going to carry the weight of that choice. If the answer is always the same group, the poor, the marginalized, the unheard, then you're not leading. You're managing inequality. There was a silence that didn't invite interruption. Even Pete, for all his skill at verbal fencing, seemed to recognize that nothing he said next would land without sounding defensive. The narrator returned, framing the moment. In the span of minutes, the conversation had shifted from personal to philosophical, from an insult about roots to a battle over the soul of governance itself. One side argued that strength required sacrifice from the vulnerable. The other argued that strength was measured by how you shielded them. Pete finally leaned back, folding his arms. The smirk was still there, but it had cooled. Jasmine didn't gloat. She simply placed her notes back on the table and sat, posture straight, her eyes scanning the room once more, not to read her opponent, but to gauge the faces of those watching. She could see it in them, the flicker of recognition when someone articulates something you felt but never put into words. This wasn't just a debate. It was a reckoning. The clash was far from over. The confrontation was still building, like a thunderhead gathering on the horizon. But for the first time that morning, it was clear to everyone in the room that Pete wasn't the only one who knew how to control a narrative. And Jasmine? She was just getting started. The air in the chamber had shifted. The earlier exchanges had been pointed, but now they felt like preludes. Pete Hegseth leaned forward in his chair, elbows on the table, speaking directly to Jasmine without looking at the committee chair for permission. His voice carried the practiced edge of a man who'd fought wars on screen and in uniform. But here, the battlefield was ideological. You talk about justice, he began, but sometimes I wonder if folks like you mistake activism for policy. His eyes didn't waver. In the real world, things aren't solved by fiery speeches. They're solved by grit, discipline, sacrifice. I've seen it overseas. I've bled for it. Can you say the same? The insult wasn't in the words. Alone it was in the way he wrapped them in personal challenge, subtly framing her as an outsider to sacrifice itself. The room stilled. A senator on the far end shuffled papers just to break the tension. Cameras zoomed, capturing Jasmine's stillness, the faint tilt of her head as if weighing the gravity of his framing. Narration sliced through the pause. It wasn't just two people talking. It was two worlds colliding, military heroism against grassroots resilience, a televised morality play where the subtext was as loud as the speech. Jasmine finally moved, leaning toward her mic. Her voice was quiet but deliberate. You think sacrifice is owned by one profession? One uniform? My family sacrificed plenty before I could stand here. My community. They've been sacrificing every single day just to be heard. She didn't flinch from his gaze. And you know what? That's grit. That's discipline. That's service. The words landed with weight, but Pete pressed on, tapping his pen against the desk. Service is measured in action, not feelings, he countered. In results, not slogans. People are tired of being told they're victims. They want leaders who can deliver, not just inspire. Gasps came from the gallery, whispers darting from row to row. One woman in the second row covered her mouth, as if the stakes had just skyrocketed. Jasmine didn't raise her voice, but every syllable was sharp. You call it inspiration, like it's a weakness. But I've seen policies fail because they lacked empathy. I've seen communities collapse because no one bothered to listen before they acted. Leadership without humanity is just control. The back and forth was surgical now. Each reply a blade, each pause a wound. A congressman shifted uncomfortably, glancing between them as if expecting the chair to intervene. But the chair knew what the cameras knew. This was the moment people would talk about for days. Pete's lips curled into a restrained smirk. So you're saying empathy can replace hard solutions? No, Jasmine said instantly, her voice ringing louder. I'm saying empathy is the hard solution. It's the part most people can't do because it requires humility, not just authority. A murmur of approval swelled from one corner of the room, quickly silenced by the chair's gavel. The two still locked eyes, neither retreating. Narration returned, describing what viewers were feeling, but couldn't articulate. That this wasn't a casual disagreement. It was a referendum on the soul of leadership itself. For some, Pete's military-hardened vision was the truth. For others, Jasmine's call for human-centered governance was the only way forward. And for everyone watching, the stakes had now become personal. Asterisk, the chair's gavel struck twice, but the sound barely cut through the static of energy hanging over the hearing room. It was as though the confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Pete Hegseth had redefined the air itself, charged, electric, and brittle. Every camera light glowed like a small sun, locking the moment into permanence. Let's proceed, the chair said, voice taut with authority, though the eyes betrayed something else, anticipation. Pete leaned back, crossing his arms. His smirk was gone now. What replaced it was a narrowed focus, the kind of gaze one gives a worthy opponent. The earlier sparring had been calculated. This was about to be a trial by endurance. I have here, Pete said, holding up a thick binder, a report detailing the failures of community-driven programs you've publicly supported. Millions in taxpayer money. Zero measurable impact. In fact, he flipped to a tabbed page. Crime rates in the pilot districts increased during implementation. How do you reconcile that with your so-called leadership? He said it slowly, letting each number drip into the silence like lead into water. A few in the audience nodded grimly, already buying into the narrative. Jasmine adjusted her mic. She didn't look at the binder. She didn't even glance at the report. Instead, her eyes swept the room, the senators, the reporters, the citizens who had lined up before dawn just to get a seat. Numbers can tell the truth, she said, but they can also be used to hide it. Pete's eyebrow twitched. You talk about crime rates without mentioning the funding that was cut before the program began. Jasmine continued, her voice even. You talk about taxpayer waste without mentioning the billions spent on contracts that never reached the communities they were meant to help. You want to blame the people doing the work instead of those withholding the tools. The room hummed with low murmurs. A cameraman shifted to get a tighter shot of Pete's expression. Pete tapped the binder. That's convenient. Blame the system when your programs fail. It's not convenient. Jasmine replied sharply. "It's the truth. And if we can't tell the truth here, in this room, on this record, then this whole hearing is theater." The word theater lingered in the air. The irony wasn't lost on the journalists present, who knew that for millions of Americans watching, this was indeed theater high stakes, unscripted, moral theater. The chair interjected. "Let's keep this civil with respect." Jasmine cut in, eyes still on Pete. "Civility without honesty is just politeness for the cameras. I'm not here to play polite while people suffer." That was the moment. The break in the dam. The shift from debate to declaration. Pete leaned forward, voice tightening. "So you admit your policies have failed?" "I admit," Jasmine said, "that our country has failed communities for decades. And I admit that the people most invested in keeping things the same are always the ones calling for more reports, more binders, more delays, while lives are on the line." Narration took over, sweeping through the moment like a slow pan of a camera. This wasn't a politician deflecting. This was a cross-examination of the system itself. It was dangerous ground. It was also the only ground worth standing on. Pete's voice dropped lower, almost a whisper into his mic, though it carried through the room. "Do you really think you can change it?" Jasmine held his gaze. "Not alone, but with the people who put me here?" "Yes, absolutely." The audience erupted into scattered applause, quickly silenced by the gavel. Pete shut his binder, slowly, deliberately. "We'll see." The tension remained thick enough to taste. Somewhere in the back row, a reporter scribbled furiously, sensing. The headline had just written itself. Asterisk. The gavel cracked down again. But this time, the sound didn't settle the room, it fractured it. The hearing was no longer a sequence of questions and answers. It had become an arena, and the crowd, whether in person or watching live, knew it. A journalist whispered to his colleague, "This isn't just testimony. It's a referendum." "Pete." Hegseth flipped open a second folder. The crisp sound of paper, sliding free, cut through the hushed tension. He held up a glossy photograiny, black and white, like it had been pulled from a security camera. "This," Pete began, "is from a rally you attended 3 years ago. A rally organized by a group under federal investigation for mismanagement of funds. You spoke there. You endorsed them. Did you know about the investigation at the time?" The air stilled. Jasmine glanced at the photo, then at Pete. Her fingers, interlaced on the desk, not defensive, but deliberate. "Controlled. I knew," she said calmly, "that they were feeding 500 children a day when no one else would. I knew that, investigation or not, those kids were going to bed with full stomachs." Pete's lips pressed thin. "So you don't deny aligning yourself with questionable organizations?" "I don't deny aligning myself with people doing the work when others only talk about it." That hit. Even the chair shifted uncomfortably, aware that Pete's gotcha had landed somewhere unexpected. But Pete wasn't done. "Representative Crockett, your rhetoric always comes back to noble causes, feeding children, helping communities. But leadership isn't about stories, it's about responsibility. You call for accountability from others. Where's yours?" Narration swelled like the camera was closing in on Jasmine's face. Responsibility. That word had been used to crush more reformers than scandals ever had. Responsibility wasn't just about actions. It was about carrying the weight of the broken pieces left behind. And in politics, the people asking the questions rarely had. To carry them. Jasmine leaned forward, eyes unwavering. "Accountability is not a one-way street, Mr. Hegseth. I've been here every hearing, every vote, every community meeting, while some of the loudest critics of my work have been absent. When it mattered most. If you want to talk about accountability, let's account for everyone's record." The chair tried to redirect. "We'll stick to the scope of today's hearing." "With respect, Madam Chair," Jasmine said, voice tightening but still measured. The scope of this hearing is truth. And truth doesn't stop where it gets inconvenient. The audience murmured again, a living current in the room. The stenographer's keys clacked faster, trying to keep pace. Pete's smile returned thin, surgical. You're skilled, Representative. I'll give you that. But skill isn't substance. People watching this might be inspired by your passion. But passion without results is just performance. Silence. Jasmine didn't answer right away. She let the words hang there, the way a seasoned lawyer lets an opponent walk a little too far into their own argument. When she spoke, her voice was softer, but sharper. Performance is pretending you care more about the efficiency of charity than the people it saves. Performance is holding binders in front of cameras while children sleep in shelters. I don't perform, Mr. Hegseth. I fight. The words hit like a verdict. Narration pulled back to the broader scene. The journalists in the front row typed with frantic precision. The senators shifted in their chairs, some leaning forward, others hiding behind legal pads. This wasn't policy talk anymore. It was moral combat, stripped bare. Pete broke the silence. And yet, after all the fighting, the statistics still tell the same story. Jasmine's eyes glinted, but not with anger, with resolve. Statistics are snapshots. They don't show movement. They don't show the mother who can now walk her child to school without fear. They don't show the grocery store that opened in a food desert because people believed change was possible. If you think the only progress worth mentioning is the kind you can put in a chart, then you've already decided which stories don't matter. The room went still again. Somewhere in the audience, someone whispered, "She's winning this." Pete closed his folder slowly, the sound echoing more than it should have. We'll let the public decide who's winning. The gavel struck once more, but it felt ceremonial now, like the formal end to a duel whose outcome had already been set in motion. And as the chair announced the recess, the camera crews surged forward, the flash of bulbs mixing with the hum of whispered verdicts from a nation already picking sides. Asterisk, the hearing room was no longer the same place it had been that morning. The air was thick, almost tangible, as though the weight of every argument, every look, every word spoken hung between the mahogany paneling like smoke from an unseen fire. Pete sat stiff in his chair, his earlier bravado dulled by the relentless clarity Jasmine had been unleashing for the better part of an hour. His tie seemed tighter now, his throat working against the knot as he avoided her gaze. Across the aisle, the press had grown restless. Fingers danced over keyboards, capturing fragments of a scene that would dominate headlines by nightfall. One reporter whispered to another, "We're past policy. This is a trial of character." The other nodded, eyes locked on Jasmine. She was standing once again, though she'd sat briefly after her last testimony. Her hands rested lightly on the lectern, but the stillness was deceptive. Her presence commanded the entire chamber. "We've been talking about qualifications," she began, voice even, but her tone carried the weight of a verdict. "About roots. About the notion that where you come from somehow defines how far you can go, or worse, how capable you are of leading." Pete leaned forward slightly, as if to interrupt, but she didn't give him the breath to do so. "Let's be clear," she continued. "My roots are not a weakness to be overcome. They are my strength. My family didn't give me silver spoons or safety nets. They gave me resilience, accountability, and the ability to see through empty flattery that hides real contempt." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Pete shifted again, his lips pressing into a thin line. She reached for a stack of documents, printed testimony from constituents, community leaders, and policy experts who'd seen her work firsthand. She read excerpts with deliberate precision, each one reinforcing the image of someone who had never backed down from a challenge, no matter how under-resourced or underestimated she'd been. Asterisk. This, she said, lifting a page for all to see, is from a teacher in a rural district who fought for funding for years. She told me, it's not about where you start. It's about how hard you're willing to fight for those who don't. Have a voice. That's the measure of strength, not some curated resume or network of privilege. Pete's jaw tensed. He tried to mask his discomfort with a faint smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. The chair of the committee leaned in. Ms. Crockett, he said, are you suggesting that the implication of weakness based on one's origin is inherently disqualifying for public discourse? Jasmine turned her gaze to him without losing a beat. I'm suggesting, she replied, that it's corrosive. It tells every young person from a small town, from a working-class family, from any background deemed less than, that they have to prove they belong before they even begin. It's a slow poison, and it's often delivered politely. The room was utterly silent. Even the air-conditioning hum seemed to fade. Pete finally broke. With respect, he said, his voice lower now, you're reading too much into an observation. I was acknowledging your journey, not diminishing it. Her head tilted slightly, almost pitying. If it had been an acknowledgment, Mr. Hegseth, it would have been framed differently. It would not have required me to stand here defending the dignity of my roots. A few reporters' pens froze mid-sentence. This was the kind of moment they lived for. The chair tapped his gavel lightly, as if to bring the tension down, but it did little to shift the atmosphere. Jasmine kept speaking not for Pete anymore, but for the record, for history. I've been underestimated my whole life, she said, her voice softening but gaining an almost poetic cadence. And each time I've remembered where I came from. It's not a shadow I escape, it's the foundation I build on. If that foundation makes anyone uncomfortable, that says more about them than it does about me. Somewhere in the back row, an older man in a faded veteran's cap wiped his eyes. He'd come to the hearing expecting politics. He was leaving with something closer to vindication. Pete didn't speak again. Not because he had nothing to say, but because the calculus had shifted. Every word now risked deepening the wound he'd opened with that 10-second jab at the start. The chair announced a brief recess, but nobody moved right away. They sat there, watching Jasmine gather her papers, every motion deliberate, every pause heavy with the unspoken understanding that the hearing had just witnessed a pivot, a moment where the target of an insult had not only defended herself, but transformed the attack into a rallying cry. As she walked past Pete's seat, she didn't look at him, but the subtle set of her shoulders, the unyielding pace of her steps, told him and everyone else that this exchange wasn't over. It was merely entering its final act. The overhead lights bore down on the hearing room, bleaching the edges of the long oak table where the two microphones waited like dueling pistols. Every face in the gallery was turned toward the front half, leaning forward in anticipation, the other half frozen in the kind of stillness that comes when history is about to step into the room. Pete Hegseth straightened his papers, but his eyes kept darting toward Jasmine. There was no cordial veneer left, now just a tightness around the mouth, the kind of restraint that spoke of pride pressed up against humiliation. He had lost ground in the exchanges, and he knew it. Yet he wasn't retreating. Not here, not now. This was the last segment before the committee moved to closing statements, and it was his last chance to land a decisive blow. He leaned toward the microphone. Congresswoman Crockett, he began, each syllable deliberate, you've spoken eloquently about resilience, about standing firm in your convictions. But resilience doesn't change hard numbers. My question is simple. His eyes narrowed slightly. Are you here to represent the facts, or are you here to represent a personal crusade rooted in your upbringing? There it was again, the pivot back to her roots. The same subtext. That had ignited the fire at the start. the implication that her lived experience was a distortion, not a qualification. A murmur stirred in the gallery. Some shook their heads. Others smirked knowingly, waiting to see if this would finally unbalance. Jasmine didn't answer immediately. She let the silence work for her, scanning the faces in the room, fellow representatives, staffers, journalists, a handful of veterans watching from the side benches. When she finally leaned in, her voice was steady, but laced with an unmistakable heat. You want to talk about facts? Fine. Fact. The policies you defend cut funding to schools and towns, just like the one I grew up in. Fact. The communities you dismiss are the same ones that send their sons and daughters to serve in wars you champion on television. And fact, Mr. Hegseth, her voice sharpened, my upbringing taught me how to survive, how to work twice, as hard to get half the recognition, and how to see through a man who thinks condescension is a clever tactic. The room seemed to contract around her words. Pete shifted in his chair, but she wasn't finished. You think being from a small Texas town is a liability. I think it's the reason I can see past the polished talking points and into the human cost of every decision made in this chamber. My so-called personal crusade is making sure that cost isn't paid entirely by people who look like me, who come from where I come from. That's not sentiment. That's justice. A wave of murmurs swept through the audience. The chair banged the gavel once, warning for order, but the tension had already tipped over into something electric. Every camera lens in the room zoomed tighter, capturing the flicker of defiance in Jasmine's eyes, and the fraction of a second where Pete's jaw clenched. He leaned forward again, this time less measured. You're twisting this into something. It's not, he said, the microphone catching the faint tremor of urgency in his tone. I respect your background. No, Jasmine cut in, her voice low but cutting through the air like glass. You use my background when it suits your argument and dismiss it when it doesn't. That's not respect. That's manipulation. The words hung between them, raw and unfiltered. Pete's face tightened, but he didn't fire back immediately. He shuffled his papers instead, a gesture that looked like control but felt like retreat. The committee chair cleared his throat. Let's keep this to policy matters. This is policy, Jasmine said firmly, turning her attention toward the chair. When identity and lived experience are treated as biases to be discounted, the policies we create are already skewed. Pretending otherwise doesn't make the prejudice disappear. It just makes it invisible to the people who benefit from it. The chair didn't respond, but he didn't interrupt again either. Pete glanced toward the cameras, a quick, almost imperceptible check of the optics. He seemed to search for a way back into the exchange that wouldn't leave him looking cornered. Finally, he muttered something about respectful disagreement and sat back, but the energy in the room made it clear the round was over. And Jasmine had won it. The narrator's voice threaded in over the scene. In politics, silence can be surrender. And in that moment, the space Pete left unfilled became the echo of his own undoing. The hearing moved on, but the emotional gravity of that clash lingered like the aftershock of a storm. Staffers exchanged wide-eyed glances. Journalists' fingers flew over keyboards, already drafting headlines that would spin through social media before the session even adjourned. On the far end of the gallery, a veteran in dress blues gave a subtle nod in Jasmine's direction, a gesture of solidarity, one soldier to another in a different kind of war. Jasmine sat back in her chair, her expression neutral again, but the set of her shoulders told a different story. She had taken the insult, dismantled it, and rebuilt the moment into a statement of strength. And though the hearing was not yet over, a narrative of the day had already shifted. From that point forward, every question directed at her was met with an attentiveness that hadn't been there before. Colleagues who had seemed indifferent earlier were now leaning in, measuring her responses with a respect that transcended party lines. Even those who disagreed with her politics couldn't deny the clarity with which she had just drawn the line between personal history and public policy. In the quiet seconds before the next speaker was recognized, Jasmine glanced toward the cameras, not to pose, not to gloat, but to ensure that every person watching at home understood. Dignity is not up for debate. Asterisk, the room was quieter now, though the air still felt thick with the heat of everything that had unfolded. Cameras panned slowly across the hearing chamber, catching the weight in every glance, every slouched posture, every fixed stare. Even those who had come expecting nothing more than partisan theater were now sitting straighter, leaning forward as if they were about to witness something historic. Pete Hegseth shifted in his seat. He was still upright, still wearing the sharp suit and Fox News anchor composure, but the earlier confidence had dimmed. There was a subtle frown tugging at his lips, the kind that wasn't meant for the audience, but for the internal reckoning of a man who had underestimated the ground beneath him. He had come to land the jab, and instead he'd walked into a crossfire.